event is part of a series of events marking the launch of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, a research centre within the Department of International Development, QEH, which will aim to contribute in different ways to a multidimensional framework for poverty reduction and human development. This event is followed, as many of you know, by a second plenary event involving François Bourguignon and Tony Atkinson, proposing new directions for research in multidimensional welfare economics. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for coming here, and to Queen Elizabeth House and our colleagues and students for your tolerance with the disruption of the normal routine activities in Sixth Week. I'd also like to acknowledge and warmly thank those who have supported this event and all of these, the work of OPHI, in particular the International Development Research Council of Canada and the Department for International Development in the UK. Finally, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ian Goldin, who has very kindly agreed to chair or moderate this conversation. Dr. Goldin is the first director of the new James Martin 21st Century School in Oxford, set up last year to develop strategies to address urgent multidisciplinary challenges of our time. Ian was formerly Vice President of the World Bank, and before that its Director of Development Policy. He has also previously been Chief Executive and Managing Director of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. As an economist who has in view problems that exceed the capacity of one discipline to address effectively, Ian makes a well-qualified chair for this session. Ian.
Thanks very much, Selina. This is really a wonderful opportunity, and I'm excited about being able to hear Amartya and Michael on this topic. It's a topic of central importance to many, many dimensions of the past, and of course, if we're going to begin to understand opportunities for the future, we really do need to get a handle on the space in this growth literature. There can be no better two people to discuss it than Amartya and Michael. Both have thought very deeply on this. Amartya, over coming on for a 50-year period, in 1960 was your first book on growth.
First and only.
Well, you
I learned better
after. Michael has worked on it for many, many years with Canaro and in many other different dimensions, and is now the co-chair of the Independent Growth Commission, which he'll tell us about, which is reflecting on these issues. And of course what they both bring to this is a much deeper understanding of growth than some might imagine economists can provide. Both are distinguished in being both philosophers and economists. Michael's first degree was actually in philosophy at Princeton. You don't always advertise that, but and then he came to Oxford, to Magdalen as a Canadian Rhodes Scholar. He did maths here, and then went on to Harvard and did his PhD in economics, worked there, and then went to Stanford, where he was, amongst other things, the Dean of the Business School, before becoming the Philip Knight Professor of Economics. He has worked on these issues in many different dimensions, many times working on the policy interface, and of course at the frontier of theory, which is the base of his Nobel Prize. Amartya is too a philosopher. I was going to say poet, but actually it's about the only thing missing that I think on your CV. 28-page CV Amartya has. At the last count, 84 honorary doctorates, and I'm sure it must be approximating 100 by now. It's a couple of years old CV I looked at. And has written so widely and broadly in the field of economics and beyond that I think there are very few people that have been absolutely able to bridge the disciplines and think about different dimensions of growth. Although your last book on growth was 1960, you have written about it many times subsequently, and even written on what I hope will be the focus of this discussion, which is what and why growth in your Oxford paper. That really is what I'm going to stimulate Michael and Amartya to talk about. I won't dwell on their CVs, it would take the whole session, but I do encourage you to look at them, to get an understanding of just how broad people can think in these issues. Michael's Nobel autobiography is the best I've read, in that it really does talk about what's important to him, which is unusual on a CV of that nature. And Amartya is just so impressive that one has to stand in awe of the breadth and contribution that he's made across so many different disciplines and understanding of the world. I'm going to ask Michael to kick off with perhaps spending about 15 minutes on what brought him to where he is now, which is his understanding of growth as he's leading in the Growth Commission, and also to give us some hints, and I know it's early days, because you still have about another year at least to go with the Growth Commission, some hints as to what might come out of this. Are we going to be seeing new ways of thinking growth? Is the space opening up? And of particular concern to this group is there going to be a broader understanding of growth? So the what for is intrinsic in the how. One gets there. We'd be very keen to hear that. I've also asked them to let us know where their website is, because there's a huge amount of work that's going into the background papers and other work being put into this Growth Commission, which I think will be a very valuable resource for us all. I'm then going to ask Amartya to try not to be too nice, Amartya. I know it is your way. But to try and stimulate the discussion by talking about some of the things that Michael hasn't picked up on. And of course you are able to capture so many dimensions of growth which economists often leave out, but I'm hoping you'll be able to bring some of that into the conversation. We'll stimulate a conversation between the two of them for about an hour, and then I'm going to open it up for the second hour to all of you to engage Amartya and Michael.
I'm going to slightly sort back, stand up. Thank you, Ian. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I actually have slides in front of me, but you can't see them, so I will tell you a little bit about the Growth Commission and my involvement, and maybe, I hope, provide a couple of useful perspectives. So what I'm going to do is talk about sort of why we're doing this, who we are, and a little bit about the sort of economics of high-speed growth and poverty reduction. And then I'll turn to one or two areas that really aren't just economics that I think make this whole thing quite hard to get done. So the Growth Commission is a group of about 18 people. The vast majority of them are political and policy leaders with a huge amount of experience from developing countries. That means they're practitioners, they're pragmatic, they like getting things done, they're very sensitive to political issues, and their hope and aim is to be helpful to their peers and the next generation of their peers. So we're not doing economic theory here. We're not going to wait around until economic and or other science is ready to give us a definitive answer. And there are many areas of policy with respect to that are relevant to growth that have really nothing by way of consensus to offer at this stage. And they're important. There's no consensus in the area of opening up in financial and sort of macroeconomic policy. There's no consensus on speed and sequencing with respect to opening on the trade and goods and services side, and there's a huge amount of controversy about microeconomic intervention in the area of industrial policy. I am going to speak about what I currently think, and if it turns out that's not what the Growth Commission thinks in a year, you'll have to forgive me, but I don't know what they're going to think in a year. We are interested in high-speed growth, and I have defined that arbitrarily as growth at the rate of 7% per year or more in per capita terms, lasting for more than 2 decades. The reason we're interested in that is that seems to be, it's a pretty high standard. We have no evidence that all countries, or even most, can achieve that. But it does produce a doubling of income every 7 years, and the results are dramatic. And if I could show you the slides, the poverty reduction in the cases where this has occurred is extraordinary. There are 11 cases of this kind of sustained high growth. 8 of them are in Asia. They are all post-war because, and a crucial element in this is the various intangible assets that the global economy offers a developing country, and they weren't essentially available or as easily accessible before World War II. I should say that Japan was close to achieving this. China is the latest one, and India is, the betting odds are that India is entering an extended period that will fit this description. The key ingredients of this is kind of the elementary market characteristics. One is the use of a market system, even if it's imperfect, which means decentralization, price signals, clear notion of ownership, and not an excessively large government. By that I mean a government that's, say, employer of last resort that crowds out the private sector and so on. The second is very high savings and investment. I say these things, and people say, yes, of course, you have to save and invest at a high rate. If your per capita income is $400, then saving 30% of the GDP is a pretty draconian and enormous exercise. The high water mark in that is China. China started at 35% in 1978 and is now running at a kind of ridiculous level, around 40 to 45%. And if the savings rate goes up about one more time, and they run a surplus that's in the 11 to 14% of GDP, there's going to be an explosion in international relations, which is actually quite worrying. Resource mobility is crucial. When you look at an economy from a macroeconomic point of view, what you see is high growth. When you look at it from a microeconomic point of view, you see people moving to new productive employment. I underline that. There is no counterexample to this. There is no example of sustained high growth that doesn't take surplus labor from somewhere and employ it productively somewhere else. And that involves movement across sectors and geographic movement. So the rate of urbanization is very high in the case of China, which has been faster than India so far. It's 1% a year, or a little bit higher. That's 13 to 15 million people a year moving into essentially cities. That means you're essentially creating Los Angeles every year in China. But the most important thing, and then I'll go on to the harder stuff, is that all of these cases leverage the global economy. That doesn't mean they're open or they're open suddenly. It means that they take advantage of the huge elastic demand that the global economy supplies. Almost no economies that are developing, with the possible exception of China and India, are big enough to turn the terms of trade against themselves. They take advantage of dynamic comparative advantage, which means basically if you're stuck with a poor economy in terms of magnitude of demand and composition, it's very hard to increase your efficiency except in a long, slow process. And it takes advantage of technology and know-how. So those are the kind of key ingredients. The fastest growing case of this is obviously China. China's averaged over 9% a year for the last 29 years. And it's kind of in middle income status and about to enter another very hard part of the growth process, which is killing off some of the things that they've come to believe are the essence of their ability to grow. It's actually, and that's the labor-intensive manufacturing. That reminds me to remind you something you already know, which is two things happen that are very often confused in the growth process. One is there is a deepening of the human capital so that the entire sort of structure of the human resources side changes. And the second thing is that holding that constant, the relative price of labor in various categories rises. That's what essentially growth in per capita incomes mean. And that rapid rise in the relative price of labor with respect to almost everything else, with the possible exception of land, is what drives the churn, the creative destruction in the economy, and it's what makes it very hard to